And I think that did it. Now we are live. Sorry for the little delay, a little fun Google Hangouts issue like we have almost every week. It's something new. They change their platform, but they tell us it's getting better. So first of all, before we get any housekeeping out of the way, our guest, Srini Rao, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, we'll get to the more formal introduction here in a second. But first of all, you're joining us. It's July 30th here. We are now just over 2 weeks away from Podcast Movement here in Dallas, August 16th and 17th. In fact, about 2 weeks from today, people will start arriving into town, checking into the hotel. There's some early events going on, so you can check out the Twitters and the Facebooks for all of those things. But the big news for right now that you need to know, if you haven't booked your hotel room yet, tomorrow is the last day to do it and not pay some exorbitant amount of money. You're going to pay, I think, 112 or 115 or something per night if you book before tomorrow. Otherwise, it's going to be way too much. So do it now and do it soon. Jared, do you have any housekeeping before we get on to the topic of tonight?
No, not really. I do want to take a minute and just say hello to people. We've got Karen and Brent, BJ, Nathaniel, Elsie. Hey, Elsie. We got Jim Queso and Karen, Larissa, Philip, Scott, Simon, Vicky. There's some no names. So people are kind of jumping in now. And, obviously, we appreciate that you're here tonight. And Srini's going to bring it, man. He's got a different perspective that I think some of you are going to really like, and some of you are going to be like, hey, that's something I needed to hear, or that's something that I haven't heard yet.
We'll get right to Srini now, because Srini Rao, he's the host of Unmistakable Creative. It's a show, it's a podcast, it's a brand, and it's growing as we speak. Just over the past year, it's become Unmistakable Creative and has grown so fast, and there's tons of plans in the future. Not sure what we can get into, but we'll see what we can get into. Before Unmistakable Creative, his podcast was known as Blogcast FM. And that's how Srini built his initial brand, and he's shaped and shifted over time to become one of the most unique things going in the podcasting or any space right now. So without further ado, Srini, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, so first of all, since this is a podcast-centric webinar, before we get too far off topic, because I have a feeling we might get into some different things tonight, can you just give everyone that's not familiar with you a background about how you first got into podcasting at all?
Yeah, and I'll talk about some of this at Podcast Movement, but I really had no aspirations of starting a podcast. We started with this weekly thing called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Bloggers, just as a blog post on my blog, and one guy emailed me and said, hey, I think you should take this out, spin it out into a separate site, and, 15 weeks later, we were, running Podcast FM, and, it's funny, when we started, it was about 5 years ago, and most people, even some of the most prominent people, were saying podcasting is dead, and I wasn't really doing it. I mean, nobody can predict the future. I didn't have a crystal ball that said, hey, next thing, in 2013, they're going to be huge. I just did it. One, I had a day job, so I could do it alongside the day job. So it just was fun. And, I thought, I had some grand visions of, my first crazy idea was like, I'll interview really popular bloggers. They'll tweet every interview, and every interview will go viral. Which, we learned that very quickly. Okay, well, that's not going to be the case. We have to produce kick-ass stuff. And so, that kind of took me through a pretty, arduous journey of getting to this point. A lot of ups and downs, and it's not, and then the ups and downs never end. I mean, I've had, you've talked about sort of the year that I've had, and we can get into that a little later if you guys want, but I've also had some very tough times in the last couple of months. So, eventually all of that led to this book, The Art of Being Unmistakable, which was self-published and became a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And then we rebranded the show because we realized, this show isn't just about bloggers. In fact, the most popular and most interesting people we interview are not bloggers. And when we talked to friends of ours who weren't into this sort of entrepreneurial world, we were more interested in their opinions because they're sort of the civilians and the masses and the mainstream. And, with what we were really set on building, which is a media company, we said we need to reach, we need to reach not the masses necessarily, but we wanted the tribe to expand to say, okay, how do we take something that we're doing and how do we find the things that are universally relatable to all human beings regardless of what they're doing with their lives, and really go in the direction of sort of a storytelling approach as opposed to sort of business how-to. And that's really been the shift of Unmistakable Creative. We launched our first event this year called the Instigator Experience. We did a live event called a monthly live event series, like just to start to see if it would even have any traction, called the Unmistakable Salon. And we're bringing on a business development director. So we're in the midst of a lot of changes.
Jared, you can't hold the microphone to your mouth unless we're going to talk, buddy. So,
Right.
Srini, it's interesting because when we're talking now and some of the things you talked about, you learned very quickly that this whole interview thing maybe isn't what it's meant, what it's made out to be. And we'll get into some of that later on today, maybe. But I know in your talk at Podcast Movement, you'll talk about what's not working for a lot of podcasters. And you talked about now you've kind of shifted into this storytelling. Can you talk about more specifically what kind of molded what it is right now that you're doing in term, because a lot of podcasters, they're kind of going through the motions. They don't actually, they're not learning anything from what they were doing, but you were learning. You did learn something from what you did. Can you kind of talk about that transformation?
Yeah, so interestingly, we sat down and in December, before we launched Unmistakable Creative, we said, what are the threads that tie our most popular interviews together? And we kind of looked at it and we said, wow, it's not one, it wasn't the big names, it wasn't who we thought it would be. And we said, what's fascinating about this? And my business partner, Greg Hartle, said, he said, really, at the end of the day, there's almost a hero's journey in each one of these stories, like a narrative of somebody who has this crazy experience, goes through hell, and comes out the other side, much better off for it. And it's fascinating, regardless of who you are, to listen to. And he said, believe it or not, we can get this out of every single guest. And he said, it really comes down to the way you direct the interview and the way you ask the questions you ask. He said, I think you need to direct it towards that as opposed to how to do things, and sort of move it from sort of a tactical to go from information to entertainment, go from education to entertainment, where entertainment became sort of the number one priority. And it's funny because I remember a while back I talked to this guy named Ben Settle, and he said, Srini, who makes more money, entertainers or teachers? And I think we all know the answer to that. At the end of the day, and that wasn't the motivation for doing it. We just saw that's where our strengths were. And that's what really allowed us to stand out. Obviously, I can't say I didn't see what was going on in the world of podcasting and think, okay, we need to, get as far away from this as possible if we're going to stand out. And really, our goal is not to become Smart Passive Income or any of the sort of popular podcasts. Don't get me wrong, all people who do great work, but we said, really, our goal is to be in the same vein as sort of an NPR-style show, like a This American Life or Radiolab, and to be in that echelon of shows with what we create. And that's really, what the work of the last 8 months has been about, is getting closer and closer to that.
Now, are you making a push towards that really, really produced style like Radiolab? Is that something you're getting into, or you're just meaning more of the kind of off the beaten path type topics?
No, I think more off the beaten path type topics. Will we get to that sort of produced path? You have millions of dollars. Yeah, some of that will happen for sure. Like we're always trying to up the production quality, because the thing is, you got to remember, as much as we vilify the mainstream media, you are still competing with them to some degree. And you know what? They have resources, and part of the reason people consume mainstream media is because the production quality is high. Like, it's not sloppy. So, will we have, producers and all of that at some point? Yeah, the goal is to be able to really just so that I can focus on one thing only, which is doing the interviews, and working really on building the company, from a creative perspective. So, yeah.
So, Srini, when you started out, you said, you were just doing some interviews with bloggers, and there's a lot of people in here that have interview-based podcasts, and they're fairly new. They haven't been doing it a long time, and the mindset is, hey, I'm going to interview a bunch of people, and at the minimum, that's likely to grow my network. Is that flawed thinking?
Yeah, completely. Well, one, and I'll tell you why. Maybe it'll grow your network, but the problem is that, what I'm watching is almost what I would call incest within the world of podcasting, right? Because the thing is, you're like, oh, I'm going to grow my network, but we're part of the same network, and we're all interviewing the same people. And you look at the list of podcasts, and it's like, wait a minute, why are all the guests the same? So you're kind of missing the whole point of that. Yeah, it could possibly grow your network, but really, if I were to say one thing about that, I would say, okay, fine, you interview somebody within your network or whatever that you meet, and you say, hey, can you tell me somebody who's completely crazy who nobody would ever think to interview? One, that's going to challenge you as an interviewer if you can really drive a story. I mean, I've talked to bank robbers, I've talked to ex-drug dealers, I've talked to people who spent years in prison, I've talked to happiness researchers, I've talked to entrepreneurs, I've talked to authors. And I think that's what's allowed me to develop the skill that I have, because I've had to, learn how to transition it across different people. Whereas if you just stay within sort of this network, one, your skill doesn't develop because you're just going through the motions. And two, I mean, is your network really growing, or are you just, connecting within the same network, and it's just this gigantic incestuous circle?
Srini, do you think everyone should podcast? And I think that I know the answer is going to be no, but there's a lot of people that say, hey, I can start a podcast and I can have some of the success that some of these other people are having. If I want to interview entrepreneurs, how do I be different from just everybody else that's doing that if I don't know any better?
Don't interview entrepreneurs, for one.
Okay.
That's probably what we're doing, right? Okay. Here's the other thing. I would say don't default to the interview format. Like, okay. Why is it that we said, the only way to do a podcast? I like what Dan and Joe did, because they were like, okay, you know what? We have an interview format, but it's more like hey, let's really screw with this guy format. That's what it was like. Let's see if we can rattle this guy's nerves a little bit. Which and I actually appreciated it. I mean, they put me in the hot seat and asked tough questions, but it didn't feel like the standard interview. But I think that we assume that it's the low-hanging fruit. Everybody says yes, but guess what? I'm like, so just because everybody says yes to interviews, that doesn't mean that you should default to that format. Go look at the most popular shows on iTunes. Not all of them are interview-based. Like, what's keeping you from saying, let me try something story-based? Let me try a Radio Lab style. Look into the craft of narrative journalism. Try doing things that nobody's done before. Mix content in ways that nobody's mixed it before. I always say it's like basically, the lessons you have, it's like advice is basically ingredients and the recipes are yours. And the problem is that nobody's using their own recipe. They're taking the advice and they're basically cooking the same dish over and over again. It's like, hey, here's a recipe for Thai chicken curry, and you know what? There's 500 places where you can get the same Thai chicken curry with the same spices with no variations whatsoever.
All right, Srini, so I got to go there. So for someone who's cooking that same curry, but now they've been, they've had that awakening, they know, okay, I need to figure out ways to be more creative. If you don't know exactly how to be creative, maybe that's not your gift, so to speak, where do you begin? Like, what advice do you have for that someone that says, hey, I do want to change this up, I don't want to be like everybody else?
That's a tough one because it's largely intuitive, right? You learn it from experience and from trying things that might not work. And I don't know that I have sort of a default answer for that, because that's something that I think comes from within a lot of people. I mean, like the way I choose my guests, somebody asked me, what does it take to get on the Unmistakable Creative? And what it takes is something that makes me curious. I mean, really, can you actually mold yourself to make me curious? No, that's ridiculous. Like, you couldn't do that.
I could start surfing or something.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of one of those things. So maybe that would be, and this is going to be the core theme of my talk at Podcast Movement is follow what makes you curious. That's and see what questions come up that don't have anything to do with with all of this. It just like. Or take the interview format and just see how you could tear it apart. There's a great book, called Inside the Box, which is about creativity, and they talk about all these concepts, and that's worth reading. It may give people some ideas, but I think that you've got to look at how am I going to put this together in a way that's never been done, and just kind of think brainstorm 100 ideas, or say, you know what? This doesn't work. I'm going to do something else. That's always an option. I think that one of the bigger sort of challenges with the world we live in online is that there's this sort of guru mindset. It's like, oh, well, so and so says everybody should start a podcast, so now 5,000 people have done it, and it's like, well, you missed a critical part. Like, okay, like I don't agree, one, that everybody should start a podcast. There are plenty of people who should never start a podcast. Mm-hmm. Because when you listen to them, it's awful. And that's and the thing is, like, I think there's something to be said for craft. Like, do you have a talent, or are you willing to develop the talent? And if honestly, if the only reason you're doing it is because some guru said that, hey, everybody should have a podcast and this is the next gold mine, it's the next trend, then you've got a problem. I mean, like I told you, we started 5 years ago when everybody said it was going to die.
Wow.
I don't know that I answered your question exactly.
I think what's interesting is that I'll use myself as an example. I'll take the hit here. I have a show. I have an interview show, and I'm still hoping to have you on that at some point. And now I know better what questions to ask you because of that. But I don't want to have a format that is just cookie cutter. That's the same old thing. But if I don't know any better, I'm just wondering, where do I go? How do I start thinking differently? And there's some people that are natural with that, Srini. You have a tremendous gift at that, but then there's some people that say, hey, I need some examples of
okay, actually, I did. You actually sparked something for me.
Okay.
You know where you go? You go and watch movies. You go and watch live theater. You go and watch live music. Probably the best piece of advice I ever got when it comes to this was from a guy named Eric Wall, who's a graffiti artist, right? And I talked to him about it, and he said, all of his work is about creating epic audience experiences. It's about taking extreme mashups from different art forms and blending them together. So I think the big mistake is to look into the world that you're already in. To look at, hey, let me look at podcasting. I mean, when we planned our event, I'll give you an example. You know what I did to get my inspiration? I watched Michael Jackson's This Is It. I was like, I want to learn how to take concepts from that and infuse them into an event environment, because I looked at it as a performance. I don't see events as events, and that's why everything we do is so distinctive. Another thing is find a creative project that you have no idea where it's going to lead you or whatever it means, and just do it. It could be drawing, could be photos, and I'll talk a little bit about where that led me in Podcast Movement. I don't want to give that away right now, but like any one of these projects could lead you down the path to something that you can't quite see now. So I always say, it's like standing in two different spots in the same room. The view keeps changing with each step forward, and that's really what I would say is it's a lot of experimentation, and you know what? In all of that, what you might discover is that you shouldn't be a podcaster, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, man. Do you know how many blogs I started that didn't pan out? Even my School of Life blog, which I ran for 4 years, hasn't been updated in months because it never quite achieved liftoff. Even though I did everything right, the truth is, as a writer, am I talented? I mean, no, because I mean, brute force. As an interviewer, yeah, like there's those skills. One is absolutely my zone of genius. Writing is definitely not. Like, I can write, but I don't have, the sort of lyric gift that certain writers do. When they just put pen to paper, everything they write sounds like poetry. But behind the microphone, it doesn't matter what the hell is going on or who I'm interviewing. That's the one place where I have a talent, and part of that is a process of discovery by just trying a bunch of shit. Like, I tried writing, I tried drawing. There's a reason I don't have a cartoon blog, because I can't draw. So these are the things I think you really have to consider is, how do I explore extreme edges of different art forms and see what might spark there. That's about the best I can do with that question.
Well, Srini, you said something that really interested me because, had you not invested that time in the writing, I'm sure that played a big part in you being able to write the book that you sold on Kindle and now has had great success and been, like you said, a Wall Street Journal best-selling book. But if you had said, okay, writing's not my strength, you might have never written that book. So what's that nice balance there of trying versus, okay, this isn't for me?
Well, again, so let's take the drawing example. You know what, I'm going to draw until the end of the year, 365 days, and you know what, I don't care what, the key to that balance is you do it because it's just fun. Like, I still write almost daily in a journal, and I'm not great at it, but I enjoy it. Like, writing is one of those things. It's kind of therapeutic. I think making the creation process its own reward is really key. So that you're not looking for some sort of external reward, especially in those creative endeavors that you're using to gain insight from. And of course, you think about, okay, you're right. I mean, the skill of writing has absolutely helped me. And so what I would say also is, like, okay, you figure, okay, I suck at this, or this isn't what I want to do. Scott Adams gave me some really great advice. He said every time you do a project, he said go into it with the idea of what skill might I gain. So we're working on a new book right now, and part of the reason I want to crowdfund this new book is because I want to learn how to use Kickstarter. Like I want to learn how to go through that entire process of crowdfunding. So that's really what I would say.
Well, Srini, I want to hit on something here that you've mentioned multiple times. That's the art of storytelling. So I'm working on a podcast right now that's not interview-based. It's best described as like a variety show. But I keep saying, like, when we're putting our segments together, it's more like traditional radio show where there's multiple segments on multiple topics. We're trying to figure out right now, how do we craft these segments so it follows that? Does it need to follow like a story arc? When you talk about storytelling, is it like that arc of a traditional story that you really had to learn about, or is there something else there?
That's a really smart question. It really varies it really depends on the content. I've tried to follow an arc that basically takes people through sort of a journey of, hey, you start out with some epiphany, you get to some, horrible moment in your life, and you come out the other side, just rocking it. And that's me. That's my personal, preference. It really depends. Every show could be different for you guys if you've got a variety thing. But I would say if you've got that, look for the common threads between all the segments, and that becomes sort of your theme. And then, how you find flow with that, I think that's going to just be a matter of experimentation. You can slice it and dice it so many different ways. You can say, hey, like, let's say you have an editor. I'll just give you an example. You say, put it together in 4 different ways. I'm like, give them variations. Say, go with this segment first, the next one do this other segment first, and the next one do this other segment in the middle, whatever, just jumble it up and see what happens. Because again, you're not going to really know. This is one of those things where this is all practice. This takes us right back to the craft. Because there is an entire craft of narrative journalism that has to happen here, and that's effectively what you're doing. And that's cool. It's really cool that you're willing to experiment with that. Maybe the biggest takeaway for anybody listening is that, like, go and see what you could do with that, and see if you could create a variety show and find a topic that you find interesting instead of, hey, let me just do interviews.
All the hate on interviews, man. I understand, the cookie cutter, and people are just following a certain thing, and you're encouraging them to be creative. So I get that, and I don't know if there's any questions in the chat room on.
Yeah.
You know what? I do. Simon made a point, and hey, this is a legitimate point. Simon said, I'm listening to this now, but this coming Monday, my interview-based podcast where I interview entrepreneurs goes live. So it's like, okay, so Simon finds himself here. Simon has dedicated himself to doing this. This is what he's going to do. So now, Srini, let's step back and say, well, if this is what you're going to do, what can you do to be different? So we've talked about maybe finding different guests, obviously, than everyone else is doing. Let's talk about what you do to prep for your interviews. Do you do anything specific to prep that maybe creates that different interview than what other people are getting?
Yeah, no, to be honest, I don't. That's a disappointing answer, I'm sure. Like, I don't do any research on my guests. Everything that I do is driven by my genuine curiosity. And okay, so Simon's point is well taken. But this isn't a marriage. It's not like you're engaged, to this process. Like, it's not like you have signed on the dotted line and said, you know what, my show launches and it's this is a life sentence. I have to do this. Like, we started out interviewing bloggers, and now if somebody says I started a popular blog, they will never make our show. It just doesn't work. So you're not, like, you can change things. You can always change things. It's not, like you're dead set on this. So see how it does, and if it works, great. But as far as how are you going to differentiate yourself, that's going to come through experimentation. Pay close attention to what you've created already. Look at what's out there, and again, don't. Here's one way you're going to differentiate yourself. Don't listen to any podcast. So unsubscribe from everyone except ours. That, or you know what? Listen to podcasts that are not interview based. Go listen to the really good ones. Go listen to stuff. And this takes us back to that whole idea of pulling from different art forms.
Okay, so what are some art forms in podcasting that you listen to, obviously, that aren't interview based?
Well, I don't listen to podcasts, so No, not really. I
Okay.
very rarely listen to podcasts, mainly because the audio is strangely not my preferred form of learning, and I don't have the attention span for them, which is ironic, I realize.
Well, I'll throw some out here, and Jared, you can jump in here if you have any. Just the first one that comes to mind, Srini already mentioned, it's Radiolab. So
Mm.
it's got that storytelling. It's really not overproduced, but it's very produced. So it's not something that us as amateurs or even most professional podcasters who are doing it full time. It's not something that they can recreate. But in terms of getting outside the box, they definitely do that. If you're into any kind of fiction, Welcome to Night Vale is doing. I mean, that's one of the biggest ones. So it's not, I'm not breaking any news here. But if you're stuck in that rut of listening to entrepreneurial podcasts, it's something completely different. And then, cheap plug, Men Seeking Tomahawks is a good one as well. Jared?
Clearly. Well, I agree with Srini. I'm not listening to a ton of podcasts myself just because I listened to so many for so long, so I've kind of scaled back. For me, I start to find that creative, I guess, creativity and different things that interest me on talk shows like comedy, like you mentioned, movies, even on various forms of social media or YouTube. I have a lot to learn in the creative aspect. I understand that, but I definitely try to be different with my show. I don't know if anyone in this group's ever listened to it, but I try to do things that are not, just like everybody else. But Srini, you mentioned movies and some other things. What are various forms of I guess media that you look to when you're, I don't know, just looking for an idea, or maybe you're not even looking at it.
Audio's not your thing.
Right.
I'll look at YouTube videos. I'll look at theater. Like music, anything. Really is it's just basically anything. Like I've never looked in the world of podcasting. Here's an example. This is actually a good one, and this isn't podcast relevant, but the takeaway should be hopefully. We were trying to figure out our about page for Unmistakable Creative, and we were like looking at everybody else's about page, which was ridiculous considering we preach don't be like everybody else, and we're like sitting here thinking like, okay, you know what, like shut down the laptops. And Greg Hartle looks at me and he said, why do you have to write an about page? He said, what needs to go on it? And he asked me, he said, well, what if we just made it a cartoon? So if you go to unmistakablecreative.com/about, you'll see, and that's one of the most heavily trafficked pages on our site, because it's so distinctive. Like nobody does an about page like that. Like there's no bios or anything. It's just it's a hilarious cartoon about who we are and what we're about. And I think that ideas like that come about when you're willing to sort of just shut everything down.
There, no follow-up. Okay. So, Srini, we talk about these interview shows or no podcast or anything, but you recently sat down and conducted an interview for your podcast of a guest that I haven't seen on any podcast, and it's a big name that it's like a lot of people will be interested to hear. So for anyone who doesn't know, what was this most recent interview you conducted?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I had this book last year that did really well, and that was courtesy of Glenn Beck. We decided to sort of flip the script and say, you know what, let's have Glenn Beck on the Unmistakable Creative. And so I went down to Dallas. You and I had breakfast right before, and I got to interview Glenn Beck. So that'll air probably in about 3 to 4 weeks.
Are you and Glenn Beck, because a lot of people hear Glenn Beck and they immediately think politics. We're not going to get into politics, but in terms of that, is that somebody you traditionally would have had on, if you rewind a couple years back?
It's weird because until last year, I barely knew who Glenn Beck was. I'd heard his name before. I didn't realize he was as famous as he was, and I have no interest in politics really. So and even the direction of our interview had very little to do with politics. I wanted to tell the story of Glenn as a person.
And obviously you had a chance to do it. Now, how did you connect with Glenn? How were you able to set that up?
Last year, because the art of being unmistakable, really caught his fancy and he loved it so much, we just ended up becoming friends. And then, sometime in June, I emailed him. I said, hey, I think I'm ready to do this. I finally got an angle that I want to take. And so I said, hey, I'd like to interview you. And so we made a day of it in Dallas.
But that's skipping the part about you said that he found your book. He found it unsolicited. It's not like you went and you tried to do this media blitz. Like somehow he stumbled across your book. He consumed it. He thought it was different enough. He invited you to be on his show, and then now 6 or 7 months later,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he returned the favor to you. But I think like that's the most impressive part. Do you have any idea how he came across your book to begin with?
He was just searching through Amazon, so I can't believe it's only been has it really only been 7 months? Yeah, it was November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. Yeah, 8 months.
Wow.
Yeah, he was just perusing Amazon. He came across it, and I think the cover got him, you know, and he was like, oh, and he checked it out, and then next thing I know, I see a tweet on Twitter saying, you know, I was like, oh, my book just went up in the rankings, and some guy's like, oh, you might want to thank Glenn Beck. He raved about it on his show, and I was like, okay. And so I'm like, who's this guy? So I check, and I'm like, that's kind of a big deal, right? And so, you know, then the media circus kind of unfolded from there. I mean, you know, the picture you guys used for the podcast movement webinar was from the Glenn Beck show.
So you're saying Glenn Beck judges books by their covers? Okay, noted.
Yeah, I guess so.
Wow. Well, some of that's luck, but then some of that too is you just did a really good job. You're really smart with what you were doing, and then somebody found it and raved about it. So that's encouraging, man. So I guess what's your encouragement to the people in the chat room that are saying, "Hey, I'm hustling, I'm working hard here. How do I set myself up for opportunities down the road, even though I can't necessarily predict, you know, what those may be?"
Show up every day for 5 more years. You know,
right.
that happened 5 years after I started. And you know, I think there's this myth that you get to a moment where you've arrived, and I don't know that that's necessarily true because, you know, I told you, I mean, there's still ups and downs. You still, it's not like you get there and all of a sudden everything in your life is perfect. I mean, we had, you know, the first 6 months of this year was just like crazy, and then we sort of, you know, leveled out. And that's hard. I mean, that's hard to go from feeling like you're on top of the world and like, you know, you couldn't be more successful to suddenly, holy shit, we're stagnating, because your standards change. Your standards completely change when you get to that place. And you know, I know that it's easy for me to say that. You know, people are like, oh, those are high quality problems to have, but you know, I mean, I didn't make a dime off of any of my actual art for. Until this year, we never really made all that much money from the podcast. I did freelance work. You know, I did whatever I could to put the pieces together. And then I, you know, finally was lucky enough to team up with an advisor and a partner who really understood business, and he basically accelerated everything to the next level. Within 6 months, a lot had changed. But, you know, I mean, and then the other thing is, you know, I took some bold steps, but, you know, I spent, you know, by putting out an event that was a really bold move that kind of you know, sort of totally changed our brand, you know, the impression of our brand. But you got to remember, I mean, like, this is 5 years of blood, sweat, tears, showing up every single day, wondering if, you know, I should quit. I mean, even as recently a month ago, should I go get a job? You know, because it's hard. And you know, is it going to lead to where I want it to? I mean, all the self-doubt. I mean, and that's the thing you got to navigate. Like, can you do it through all of that? Can you keep showing up? With no idea whether it's going to lead to anything. Because you know what? There's a very distinctive possibility for many people that it's not going to lead to a damn thing. If there's thousands of shows being started, let's just be honest. It's like, oh, everybody is going to make it. You know, I did everything that you should do with the School of Life blog, and you know what? It never quite achieved liftoff. It just didn't. I didn't get any of the huge sort of opportunities. I mean, I had 2 posts go viral in the 4 years that I wrote on it. You know, and of course, you know, I mean, the whole time I had, and you know what? I had the best advice imaginable for how to grow a blog, and I couldn't do it. You know, because I had Blogcast FM running alongside it. It was literally like interview somebody, and everything I would learn in an interview I could put to use. And you know what? It never quite achieved liftoff. So you got to really consider the possibility of that, and say, you know, am I willing to put, you know, as much as I can into this without any concern for any reward? And will I do it just for the joy of it? Because I think then it becomes a lot more enjoyable, and that's hard. I mean, it's not easy to sit around and say, oh, well, you know, I can keep doing it. And that's where, you know, people get weeded out. You know, a lot of you guys are saying that, you know, there's all these podcasts starting. I can promise you, a lot of them won't be here next year. Because that's just the way people are.
So, Srini, based on the experiences you've had moving forward, how are you gonna decide when is it time to stop doing something that's not working? What's that barometer check that you'll give yourself, and you'll be like, okay, I'm willing to last up to this point, but I'm not willing to, you know, fight this out for just to see.
Sure. Well, I've reached it. I mean, I reached it to some level because I'll tell you, like, we got it to as far as we could go with just me and one other person. And I realized, I'm like, I don't think I can be the CEO of this company. I don't think I can get it to the next level. Like, I realized I'm not skilled. The skill that I possess isn't what I need to scale it. And that, could I do it with 10 more years of trial and error? Yeah, I mean, and that would suck. It would be awful. So basically, I think that you have to reach sort of a point of frustration or a point of just pure stagnation where you're looking at it and you're like, nothing is happening. And you know what? And the funny thing is, in the beginning, that's fine. But if you had the year that we've had and then you hit a point of stagnation, that's problematic. And that's when you kind of know. You say, okay, you know what? Clearly, you'll know because either one, nothing will be happening, or suddenly problems that you didn't have will appear. And that's kind of the point that we reach. So that's what I would say.
Well, I think perception is reality. I mean, I hear you say there's been some challenging months, but then, you're talking about interviewing Glenn Beck, you're keynoting at the podcast movement, which we feel is a big deal. So there are some positive things going on, so it's interesting to hear, the other side of that.
Don't get me wrong. Look,
right.
And I am honored that you guys would have me keynote the event and that you asked. That's awesome. Like, to be able to talk to so many people. So let's actually dissect this perception versus reality thing, because this is really important, believe it or not. And this actually will have a lot to do with your self-esteem as you go through this. Like, you can look at me and say, oh yeah, you know what, Glenn Beck, podcast movement. But I've had some struggles in terms of like, I've had my own money issues, and it's not like I'm sitting on a mountain of cash, right? Like, you have a book, the book does well, book royalties eventually go down. I mean, not every person on the planet is going to buy your damn book. Like, I'm not Oprah. So those are things you have to consider. And the reason this is worth thinking about, is that when we're on the internet, we're crafting personas to a large degree, and of course, like, you always want to make sure the gap between who you are online and who you are in person is fairly narrow to some degree. But as you grow, I think that there comes a point at which there has to be separation, and there is some of it that is crafting an image to some degree, because you are a public figure. Like Glenn Beck gave me an example. He said, he can't even go out in public with his kids because of, what people say about him, and that sucks. And so that changes things a lot. But what you have to realize is that what you're seeing on the internet is one dimension of who a person is. It's one dimension of their life. You see the dimension of Srini, the keynote speaker, Srini interviewing Glenn Beck. You see the dimension of me through the unmistakable creative, which is the front face. And the truth is, at this point, the brand has evolved beyond me. Like, people actually know unmistakable creative more than they know my name, which is a great thing. That's what we want. But you really have to realize that that's what is happening. And then the other thing is, everybody thinks everybody is richer than they really are.
Wow. Okay.
Hey, we got a question in the chat room, Jared. Philip wants to know, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but we'll maybe get a little deeper. He says, can Srini give a bit more about his work and career background prior to those last 5 years of doing the podcast? And then what was the catalyst for you to make the jump when you started doing this 5 years ago?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm basically the ultimate corporate misfit. I've been fired from damn near every job I've been at. But I worked in sales for a couple of software companies, went to business school, and what sort of prompted my interest in content was, funny story is that I swore that people would ask me in business school, what are you going to do when you get out? And I said, as long as it has nothing to do with the internet, that's what my career is going to be about. So clearly that didn't go according to plan. And so, I actually was the social media intern with Intuit's TurboTax group between the summer of my first and second year of business school. And, I instead of working on my job, I just created things and played with. Every time an online tool came out, I read about social media, I started a blog, and ironically, because I spent so much time creating stuff, they didn't actually give me a job. At the end, they said, my boss told me, he said, I don't think he's like, I'd be doing you a disservice if I gave you this job. And I was pissed. I was really angry at the time because I thought it was the ultimate failure to not, get my job offer and like my $90,000 salary. So, I mean, really what prompted it was when I got out of school, I needed a way to find a job, so I started a blog, and, that kind of one thing led to another. And I actually had a day job where I ended up working as the content strategist for an online travel company. I managed all their social media and built a blog for them. And I didn't make the leap. I was forced into it. The hours at my day job came to an end. First they reduced them to 10 hours a week, and then they came to an end. And when I got back, I lived in Costa Rica for 6 months. Broadcast FM had started to take on a life of its own, and it was big enough at that point that not big enough that I could live off of it, but big enough that it would open the door to a job interview, and then I would go to the job interview and say, the very reason we called you in is the reason we can't hire you, because it was very clear that I wasn't gonna. My intention was not to build a career at any of these places. It was just a way to get a check so I could fuel what was going on. So yeah, I was kind of forced into it, to be honest.
Well, one of the interesting things, because you mentioned you were in Dallas and you and I got a chance to hang out for a little bit before you met with Glenn Beck, and I told you about what now seems like kind of a small discussion that a buddy of mine were having about, podcast. Should we still call it a podcast because there's all these podcasts in there that suck? Should we call it a show? And I asked you what your thoughts on that were, and then all of a sudden you were like, it doesn't matter because, for what you're doing, it's just a small portion of what your visions are for the brand. So can you talk about kind of that growth of the brand? Because right now the podcast is the most visible portion of it.
No, yeah, the podcast is absolutely the most visible portion, and it is the sort of hub of our brand, right? Glenn gave me a great example. He said, okay, this is your hub. He said, don't mess with the hub. He's like, don't, because the hub feeds everything else. But the thing is, the way we've built Unmistakable Creative, it's led itself very naturally to extensions of that brand. So, this year, like I said, we had the Instigator experience, so now we're in the event business. We have a book. We're working on another one, so that puts us in publishing. Probably at some point within the next year we'll be making film. Maybe next year and a half we'll be making films. So we're looking at real media companies as an example of how do we build, because we've got the core product. Now the question becomes, how do you scale? I mean, and some of our films will be short animated films. But the thing is that we've got, with the way we've told our stories, they can translate into multiple mediums. And we're also just really sort of optimized and primed for doing really cool physical merchandise because we work with so many talented artists. So, if I would say, if you look at it, 6 months, I mean, within about 2 months, within a month, probably about 3 to 4 weeks, we'll have an official site with all our board of directors, all of that. I mean, we're bringing on a biz dev director. We're going to build a board of directors, which will include advisors from Silicon Valley, advisors from media, advisors from art and creativity. So really building sort of a media company that fits, that serves the creative professional. So like the way Bloomberg serves financial professionals, the way what do you call it? CNN or any of these places, serve certain types of people. Our goal is really to be the media hub for creative professionals or people who are just creative and really interested in these stories. So that becomes a much larger platform. So that next year Instigator experience it'll still always be 60 people, but the goal is, hey, let's get 1,000 applications for 60 spots, so that it does become sort of the boutique event where it's like as prominent as TED. We want it to be in that same conversation. So. The vision is very different than what it was even 6 months ago. Like, we're thinking much bigger now, and of course that requires a whole different skill set, some of which requires other people and a lot of help. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And something you mentioned there kind of hits on a different side of that. You talked about how you guys want to become kind of like the go-to place, and you said creative professionals or just creative people, and that's like a specific group of people you're looking for, but it also at the same time seems very broad, almost like a moving target. Who is your audience now?
Yeah, that's a funny thing with our audience, right? Is that we're in this very weird sort of phase of evolving out of serving entrepreneurs, like which we have for a long time, to people who have started to listen to us purely for entertainment purposes. So we're in this flux where the audience is evolving into sort of like people who listen to Radiolab, they listen to it because they like Radiolab, and we're starting to really kind of go through that evolution, which has had its challenges. It's because the audience is in an evolutionary flux. You go to an advertiser, like, who the hell is your audience? Like, well, everybody. and they kind of are right now. I mean, we've gone from this one little group to everybody. But again, we're building something with the intention of reaching literally millions of people. My goal is within the next 3 to 4 years is to build a multi-million-dollar company that is, when you go onto the internet, like Inc., Fast Company, whatever, it's in that same conversation, like with that prominent.
Srini, what's your role currently? Because obviously it's shifting with all the
Yeah.
opportunities that are going to be coming up. You've been a lot. You've been a lead person. So what happens next for you? Like, what role do you play in this?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. My role is going to be basically being the chief creative director, where I'll be responsible for the creative direction of events, working with the artists. Of course, I'll still be the host of the show always. So really focusing on the creative aspects as opposed to sort of the business development and how do you generate revenue and make money type of thing. Because it's proven that is not my forte. Like, otherwise, in 5 years, why haven't I been able to do it? Because it's not my strength.
Right. Now, when you start getting into movies and quote unquote TED Talks, those kinds of things, are you still going to play an active role in those?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean that's the stuff that I love doing. It's the stuff I'm really good at. Like the event aspect of it, was just an absolute blast. You got to look at what do you enjoy doing as well, and sometimes I think we neglect that.
Well, so one thing. Oh, go ahead, Jared.
Well, I just wanted to ask about events. Obviously, Podcast Movement is an event. What kind of events do you enjoy going to?
I can say he doesn't enjoy the kind of event we're putting on.
Ouch, but we're glad you're coming.
Well, I'm coming because it's Dan. If it hadn't been Dan who asked it, I might have said no. But
really,
like
cool.
I support what you guys do. I mean, I believe in what you guys are doing. And honestly, I was really impressed with what you guys have pulled off. I mentioned it, I think, even on Azil's podcast. I said, the amount of meticulous detail that you guys have put into something you've never done before, and the fact you pulled off the Kickstarter, I commend you guys for that, and you should really pat yourselves on the back. So, if it hadn't been for Dan, I don't know that I would have, but he's right about what he said. I tend to look for very small events. I don't like them bigger than 100 people. I like, even our event was 60 people on purpose, and it just, I like events where you can do things that aren't scalable, where you can really have sort of a custom experience. I like the fact that there's an application process for certain events. Like, the room is not just a free-for-all of people. It's been very, very curated. And I just, the other thing is I want to go to events where I'm going to meet people from all walks of life, not just sort of this incestuous circle. Like, that's why I stopped going to some of the bigger social media conferences, because I felt like I was just meeting the same people over and over again.
Well, Srini, I got to, since you told us to pat ourselves on the back, I do have to thank you, because that Kickstarter campaign that most of the people, or probably half of the ticket sales came from, or at least the first third of them, that whole campaign, a lot of the copy was with your guidance and influence, because I did when I first went in there and I put the whole Kickstarter page together. I sent it to you and you're like, it's all wrong. You're not doing this right. And I'm like, okay, well, one of us is a bestseller, Wall Street Journal bestseller, and one of us is not. So that changed how that whole everything was written about describing the conference on the Kickstarter page, and the feedback I got from that second, third, fourth draft that you helped put together, it really worked to obviously get us where we are today. So this conference might have been closer to the size that you enjoy had you not helped me out there. So you gotta take a little credit for that. But you mentioned it's not a conference you typically go to, but we're very excited to have you, and we're about to get into like a little preview about what you're going to talk about. And I think this whole talk kind of has been that. But I think you're going to come up on stage at Podcast Movement. In the people in the webinar can already attest to this. But you're going to say things that no one else will say, and you're going to have different opinions and have a different point of view, and you might even ruffle a few feathers, and that's exactly what these kind of conferences need. They don't need that incestuous everyone pat each other on the back, everyone say the same things. So I mean, I think even though this isn't a conference you would typically go to, I think it's very valuable when putting on a conference to have those type of people on the stage.
Well, yeah, no, I hope so. I mean, I really hope that the takeaway will be that you've got, we've all got things that make us unique, and I really hope that people, are going to be able to tap into that and find them.
Well, Srini, I want to say thank you because let the record show you were the very first person that said yes to us when we were first going out and asking people that we liked and trust. You were the first one. That's true. So the first, especially our first keynote, and that means a lot to us. Now, fast forward, we've had a little bit of success with this, but in the beginning, it was unknown. There was a lot of what ifs, and like you said, your connection with Dan and just your generosity, I personally appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, so before we wrap up here, is there anything we didn't do well enough to preview your topic at Podcast Movement? Are we going to leave it all in the bag, or is there anything else we can say? Not that people have a choice. I mean, it's a keynote, so you're the only show in town that time. So.
Right. Well, let's leave it in the bag for now. I still have plenty that I'm going to work on, but yeah, let's leave it at what we've talked about.
Well, very cool. And just a quick question. Philip wants to know, have you ever spoken at a TED conference? And if not, why not?
No, I have not spoken at a TED conference. One, because if I get to to that stage, I want it to be as good as possible, and I'm not quite there yet. And honestly, here's why I haven't spoken at TED. I haven't cured cancer. That's my ongoing is that you have to do something so epic that it warrants an invitation to TED, and I don't think I've done that yet.
Hey, can't argue with that, and that's I think a good thing to end on. Jared, do you have anything else to?
Yeah, actually, the one-dimension thing you talked about is I think you have that self-doubt still, Srini. I think you're doing great things, and you should definitely be on a TED stage.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
All right, well, guys, thanks for joining us once again. You can go to podcastmovement.com, read a little more about Srini, read a very vague description about his talk. Of course, you got to be there to actually get in deep to what's going on. If you haven't got your hotel room yet, go to podcastmovement.com/hotel. Lock it up. You got about 24 hours to do so. And with that, I'll sign off for Jared and Srini. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.